In this lecture, we'll again use the totalitarian framework to understand how the Soviet Union under Stalin functioned as a regime. In other words, we're going to focus on Stalinism not as an ideology, but as a method of political organization, which used a similar combination of consent and terror in the pursuit of a total transformation of society, which, as in the case of Nazi Germany, of course, was carried out at a tremendously high cost in human lives. The first question to ask is why two regimes with such different goals used comparable methods of rule. So the Nazis built a state that was constructed around an extreme nationalism and racial purity. And the communists, according to Marx and Lenin, sought to set up a society based on economic equality, in which capitalist competition and the exploitation of the poor would be destroyed and replaced by common ownership, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. So here we have two very different sets of goals, one based on a racial hierarchy, the other based on economic equality. But although Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were based on completely different ideologies, they shared, I think, one important characteristic. A characteristic in common that made both ideologies or both regimes susceptible to the totalitarian concept. That is, both communism and fascism claim to have discovered a unified collective goal that was more important than any individual goals. So as we said earlier, both theories rejected the liberal assumption that society existed to allow individuals to pursue all of their multitude of individual life projects. Both ideologies instead claimed that the individual's duty existed in or lay in serving a collective good, whether it was the class or the race. Significantly, in both cases, of course, it was the state that defined what was good for the class or the race. And this reverses the theory of the state, in which the individual exists to serve the state rather than the other way around. And of course, that theory of the state provides the perfect justification for the extinction of individual freedom, which of course is totalitarianism. Now, people can debate whether or not this means that all collective projects to build a better society could lead to totalitarianism. That could be a debatable question. But it's true, I think we can all agree, that the combination of a mass society and an ideology that doesn't respect individual rights is a dangerous combination. On the other hand, of course, many people seem to yearn for collective goals to escape individual alienation. So clearly there's no easy and obvious balance between that kind of polarity between the individual and the collective. How then did Stalin use totalitarian methods to pursue his vision of the communist revolution, a process that has been labeled Stalinization? Answering this question is more controversial than in the case of Nazi Germany because politicians and scholars have argued about the nature of the relationship between communist goals and totalitarian methods. In terms of Nazi Germany, there's been little debate. That is, most people have accepted that totalitarian methods were, in a sense, essential to the Nazi project from the very beginning. It was a project in which massive repression was built in. That's sort of beyond debate. But in terms of the Soviet Union, that question has sparked enormous debate, I think largely because of the politicized Cold War context. In other words, official policy in the West insisted that communism was inherently totalitarian, that those two things were linked from the very start, while leftist scholars insisted that communism and totalitarianism were not the same thing. So the debate really was, on the one hand, one camp argued that the Soviet Union was the epitome of the the epitome of the communist nightmare. The opposition argued that it was the epitome of communism betrayed by totalitarianism. So those are the two camps. Those who argued that communism was betrayed often focused on the rupture between the first period of 1917 to 1923, which is often called the First Revolution, and the second period after Stalin consolidates power from 1937 to his death in 1953. he had such a powerful impact on shaping the Soviet state that, of course, the word Stalinization was created to mark that impact. And this is often called the Second Revolution. So those who emphasize communism betrayed emphasize the rupture between the First and the Second Revolution. So they argue that the First Revolution was a period of experimentation, in which Lenin and the Bolshevik Party tried out different methods of establishing communist rule or a communist regime. From this experimentation, they argue two different models emerged. The first emerges during the initial period of civil war, from 1918 to 1921, in which the regime institutes and initiates a period of rapid and forced change, which tried to transform everything overnight, to transform the world from day to night into a socialist utopia. Everything from styles of dress to sexual mores to the economic structure and so on. This model really almost requires totalitarian methods. To change everything rapidly, to change millions of people's beliefs overnight, is very difficult to do without some kind of massively repressive structure to impose that change. But again, following the argument of these scholars, after 1921 and until Lenin's death in 1924, they would argue that a new model was tried, the so-called New Economic Policy, or NEP. As a result of earlier resistance to rapid change during the Civil War period, and the sense that they were alienating many people through pushing this kind of rapid change, the Bolsheviks moved to a model of more gradual change. That is, that you couldn't force communism on the people, they had to be gradually educated to its benefits. So one model, in other words, pointed in the direction of a less repressive state, while the other one carried the seeds of Stalinism. Now, the other camp, the camp that in a sense equates communism with totalitarianism, tells a more seamless story of the revolution. That is, that the seeds of Stalinism, the seeds of totalitarianism were there implicit from the very moment of the illegitimate Bolshevik coup, and that the differences between the first and the second revolution are really only in degree and not in kind, and also that NEP, the period of New Economic Policy, was really a strategic withdrawal rather than a change in direction. So those are the two ways of arguing about the relationship between communism and totalitarian methods. However, both camps would agree that, whichever position you favor, both camps would agree that these methods are perfected during the Stalinist period, so that we can focus on this period with the general agreement of all scholars. What Stalin did when he consolidated power is to initiate a new period of rapid revolutionary change and confrontation, what's called, again, the Second Revolution. He and his supporters insisted that the evolutionary path to communism was too slow. That gradual notion of educating over generations was too uncertain, and that the Soviet Union had to complete the transformation to socialism as quickly as possible, no matter what the cost in the short term. This kind of attitude, I think, is expressed nicely in a quote by a Communist Party member who was looking back at this period. Quote, "With the rest of my generation, I firmly believed that the ends justified the means. Our great goal was the universal triumph of communism, and for the sake of that goal, everything was permissible. To lie, to steal, to destroy hundreds of thousands and even millions of people, all those who were hindering our work or could hinder it, everyone who stood in the way. And to hesitate or doubt about all of this was to give in to intellectual squeamishness and stupid liberalism, the attribute of people who couldn't see the forest for the trees." Unquote. I think there's no clearer statement of the willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for the collective good than that revealing quote by that Communist Party member, the justification of totalitarian methods in pursuit of a collective goal, the forest instead of the trees. What further complicated, though, Stalin's project of rapid conversion to communism is that the less developed Soviet economy and state didn't have the same sort of mass society tools that were available to the Nazis in the early 1930s. Remember, the Soviet Union in 1917 was a largely agrarian, unindustrialized society. It didn't have that kind of mass media network. It didn't have the kind of basis for a homogenized society that existed in Nazi Germany. So what Stalin had to do then was to forcibly create the conditions of mass society at the same time that he tried to manipulate and shape it. In other words, he had to create a homogeneous population that was susceptible to the single message and then deliver that message at the same time. We can see this parallel process at work in the two major economic projects carried out by the regime. First, the rapid transformation to an industrial society, and second, the rapid and forced collectivization of agriculture. Stalin believed that the first communist priority was completing the economic transformation from capitalism to socialism. And remember Lenin's notion that the economic revolution would follow the political revolution. So the political revolution had been accomplished in 1917, and now the economic revolution had to follow. The first part of this economic revolution would be to complete the industrialization of the Soviet Union. Once again, it was assumed within Marxist theory that socialism could only take place in an advanced industrial economy. The second part of this economic revolution was to complete the transfer of private property from the individual to the collective. And what that meant most specifically during the Stalinist period is agricultural property, which had been seized by individual peasants during the 1917 revolution and was being farmed individually by them. So turning that individual property into collective farms was the second part of his project. At the same time as he was carrying out this economic revolution, you can see in the process of massive industrialization and collectivization that Stalin was able to create a homogeneous working class and peasantry that could then be more easily manipulated and controlled from above. In order to carry out this ambitious transformation as quickly as possible, Stalin justified even further concentration of power in the hands of the state than had occurred during the first Bolshevik Revolution. In his mind, the state was the agent of the communist revolution, and that's how he could justify concentrating further power in it, and of course focusing all individual energies. But Stalin went even further than the first Bolshevik Revolution, and in this respect, he's more similar to Hitler than to Lenin. That is, Stalin elevates himself above the state as the sole agent and embodiment of the communist revolution. So he wasn't even part of the Communist Party anymore. He was above the party. And the state and the revolution becomes equated with his own power and authority. In this way, he could justify the concentration of all power in his hands as furthering the communist revolution. So what we see from the outside as a kind of megalomania was justified in his own mind as the embodiment of the communist revolution. So in addition to his economic policies, the third pillar of Stalinism becomes this political revolution, to turn the state and the party into the direct arm of Stalin himself. So if you want to look at it schematically, the Bolshevik Revolution had been one, or the political revolution had been one in which the party takes over the state, while the Stalinist second revolution is one in which Stalin takes over the party. What was the impact of these projects on the development of the totalitarian state in the Soviet Union? Stalin's economic revolution was inaugurated with his first five-year plan in 1929, in which he set out the goals for a fully planned non-capitalist industrial economy. The linchpin of the plan was heavy industry. Stalin himself had taken his name from the Russian word for steel, which is what Stalin means. So it was almost an obsession with him. What the plan in 1929 did was set out unreachable goals for economic growth within 5 years, and then to push for those goals to be achieved within 4 years. The increasing production was given an intense sense of urgency that created a kind of cult of iron and steel production. Workers were made to feel as if they reached these goals or even went above these goals, that they were contributing to something larger than themselves. They were contributing to building the socialist revolution. You know, it wasn't just about hammering out a piece of steel, it was about building the revolution. And if they failed to reach those goals, they were slackers. They were enemies of the state. So in other words, you can see this process of workers' energies being redirected away from individual desires, individual projects, and focused, homogenized as a mass workforce that was pursuing this grander goal of building the socialist society. The results of this focus of energies was dramatic. At the end of the 1930s and several five-year plans, the Soviet Union was one of the major modern industrial states. Between 1928 and 1932 alone, industrial production more than doubled. However, while the basic statistics of increased production and the transformation to industrialization sounds impressive, the problem is that this industrial growth really benefits the state more than its population. Thus, for example, the growth in industrial production was all directed towards the needs of the state. It was concentrated largely in military, technology, and in defense needs. So what this meant was that the benefits of massive industrialization didn't reach most people. There was no focus on consumer goods that would improve the daily lives of people. Wages were kept low, so living standards were down. So industrialization made the Soviet Union a powerful nation, and it proved that they didn't need capitalism to succeed, but it didn't improve, really, the lives of ordinary working people. And again, you can see how the focus of this whole process of economic revolution was not really to benefit individuals, but to benefit the greater image of the Soviet Union as a communist society, as a socialist society. And ironically, I think this revolution ends up not only sacrificing individual welfare, but even sacrificing the welfare of the very working class that it was supposed to be defending. And yet, of course, workers were willing to work hard, were willing to put everything into it because they were convinced, and here's the propaganda side of it, they were convinced, they believed that they were doing some great task, that they were making this universal socialist revolution that then would be the model for the rest of the world. Of course, later what happens is that many people stop believing this, but that's really a phenomenon of the post-World War II period. An even more chilling example of this dynamic occurred in carrying out the plan to collectivize agriculture. In theory, the collectivization of agriculture was part of the communist goal of raising living standards, and especially of equalizing the unequal rural class structure in the Russian countryside. But in practice, of course, collectivization became a terroristic campaign in which the peasants had no choice in the matter. Stalin began the process in the early 1930s because he insisted that the independent peasants, the kulaks, as they were called, were hoarding food and hiding it from the government. And what happens, in fact, is that there's a problem of getting enough food into the cities, and Stalin uses the kulaks as a scapegoat. You know, that it's their selfish individualism that is keeping the grand collective goal from moving forward. So agriculture would be reorganized into collective farms, which then could be supervised by the state, which could requisition the proper amount of grain that it needed. The kulaks who didn't work on the new collective farms were supposed to move to the city and get jobs as workers in the expanding factories. The upshot of this process of collectivization was that the state succeeded in completely reordering rural society in a process that was as dramatic and brutal as the Nazi racial reordering of German society. The result was a homogeneous mass peasant population which could then be controlled and directed. By forcing collectivization, the state destroys the traditional peasant village, the mir, and replaces those villages with new Soviet communes, the kolkhozy, each of which, of course, is controlled by a central government official. So you can see the kind of homogeneous administrative structure that sets up in rural society. By the end of the 1930s, 90% of the peasants who are left on the land work on these kolkhozes. So it's almost a universal administrative structure. In addition, millions of other peasants who are forced to emigrate or who are left without farms to work were forced to emigrate to the cities for industrial jobs after their land was taken away. The upshot of this whole process was the most massive demographic transformation the world had ever seen up to that moment. From 1920, when only 15% of the Soviet population live in cities, to 1940, when 55% of the population was urban. So a massive transformation from a rural agrarian society to an urban one. So the state forced the massive and rapid reordering of Soviet society to fit its own goals, destroyed what was left of the local community societies, and imposed a uniform rural culture that was completely vulnerable to state control. Of course, it goes without saying that the human cost of achieving this goal was staggering. Not only were millions of people displaced, but several more millions died in the war waged against the so-called class enemy, the kulak. An estimated 5 million kulaks died from hunger and disease, both because of the chaos of the transition to collectivization, but also because Stalin simply refused to supply food to people that he claimed were hoarding grain. Instead, he sent his agents out to requisition more grain than the peasants had, leaving them starving while convincing people in the cities that the kulaks were sabotaging the revolution. As one party member recalled, quote, "I shall never forget 1932, no matter how long I live. The peasants lay helpless in their huts with swollen limbs. Every day new corpses were taken out, and yet we had to get bread out of the villages somehow and fulfill the plan," unquote. But despite those swollen corpses, many Communist Party members were convinced, like this one, that the suffering of these individuals was justified in terms of the larger goal that Stalin had impressed on them. As another party member said, quote, "That was how I reasoned, and everyone like me, even when I saw what total collectivization meant, how they mercilessly stripped the peasants in the winter of 1932 and 33. For I was convinced that I was accomplishing the great and necessary transformation of the countryside, that in the days to come people who lived there would be better off for it, and that those who sent me knew better than the peasants how they should live," unquote. So just as in Nazi Germany, where many were convinced that the Jews had to be expelled from the community, or that the mentally handicapped had to be euthanized in order to purify Germany, that the sacrifice of some was justified for the collective good of building a better society as it was imagined. By 1933, then, only 4 to 5 years after Stalin consolidates power, the country had been transformed economically with large-scale centralized agriculture, the liquidation of independent farmers, and the establishment of a solid base for heavy industry. All this at the cost of millions of lives and an atmosphere of permanent terror. But as in Nazi Germany, this transformation was achieved not only through terror, and in fact could not have been achieved only through terror. It needed the cooperation of millions like those party members who believed that they were accomplishing some greater goal, that they were participating in this project. So the regime's ability to whip up mass enthusiasm for this goal is the flip side of the terrorist project to isolate the kulaks and create this homogeneous rural society. The same methods appear in Stalin's political revolution, in which he purged the party of millions of members in order to create a homogeneous mass party completely submissive to his will. The justification of this process, as I said before, was to make the state a more efficient tool of the communist revolution, which, again, in Stalin's megalomaniacal mind, was embodied in his own person. With this justification, he began a purge of the party, particularly targeting those who had joined the party before 1928, that is, who didn't owe their job to Stalin's position. What made this political revolution totalitarian, I would argue, was not simply that millions of people were dragged off and put into gulags or executed. It wasn't just, again, the repressive side of it. It was the fact that this purge was legitimated through public trials, in which officials had to publicly go on record as admitting their guilt and admitting that they had betrayed the revolution. So in other words, it wasn't enough to simply punish them. They had to publicly admit that they deserved it. And that's that sort of very complicated balance of consent and terror. This process, I think, is described poignantly in a book by Arthur Koestler called Darkness at Noon, where he describes that a combination of torture and persuasion used to convince one party official that he had to publicly admit his sins for the good of the revolution and the party. The political revolution culminates with the so-called Great Purge of 1936 and 37. By 1939, 1 million party members had been internally exiled in camps like those described in the books of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, or executed. And by 1941, the labor camp population had reached 3.5 million, most of them there on trumped-up charges. The attrition rate among high officials in the party and the state was dramatic. As many as 70% of all high party and state officials are ousted during the purge. Of the remaining party members in 1939, 70% had joined the party since 1929. So in other words, the Bolshevik Party over the course of the 1930s is completely renovated, or virtually completely renovated. This kind of uniformity imposed through a reign of terror is chillingly illustrated, of course, in Solzhenitsyn's great work on the Gulag. As the author paints it, life within the camps becomes an exaggerated version of the imposed uniformity of life under Stalinism. So all prisoners wear the same clothes, they're referred to by numbers, they have every part of their lives regimented. As the narrator says at one point, even a prisoner's thoughts were not free, but kept coming back to the same narrow questions of existence. This, of course, is the totalitarian nightmare. But even here in the camp, where Stalinism takes on its most totalitarian qualities, Solzhenitsyn argues that there are still gaps in this authority. So the system, while it tries to break down all human relationships, the members of the gang actually stick together and act cooperatively in order to survive. In other words, the state hadn't managed to completely break them down into shivering, atomized individuals. So again, as in the case of German fascism, the regimes have totalitarian projects, but fall short of attaining complete control over their populations. So we can hope, then, that totalitarianism may never be fully realized, but always exists in tension with the force of free will digging escape routes through its facade. Nevertheless, Stalin's Soviet Union came as close as any country besides Nazi Germany to turning the country into a totalitarian state in which all independent actions were channeled into the greater goals of the state. Like Hitler, Stalin harnessed all of the energies of millions of Soviets and directed them to a single purpose. And as with Hitler as well, millions of Soviets had to be complicit with this goal in order for the totalitarian regime to work. So all of those comrades who accepted the peasants with bloated stomachs, accepted the gulags as part of the process of building communism, helped make the totalitarian state. With its mixture of consent and terror, they helped make it function. And one of the lessons, I think, of these regimes is how well totalitarianism can function. That is, if we look at just the kind of bottom line results of the transformation of society that these regimes carried out, it's a powerful thing to harness all individual wills to a single goal. But the irony, of course, is that in the process, many of the original communist goals were lost, either inevitably or through betrayal, depending on which perspective you take. And in place of these goals stood a totalitarian state which was more concerned with simply protecting its own power than with the collective good that it was supposed to promote. So while the totalitarian regime began as a means to an end, it ends up as, or it winds up being, a nightmarish end in itself.